In my first JJK video, I expressed how much I love the series' power system and how it contributes to making the fights as good as they are. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly encourage you to go back and do so. But to paraphrase, the Jujutsu system is one of checks and balances that makes fights in the series feel much more like a chess match and not so much the typical meathead shonen fare. Of course, since this is a weekly shonen battle manga, the series is filled to the brim with awe-inspiring and jaw-dropping fights. That should go without saying. But I got to thinking recently, this series has so many good fights, it'd be impossible for me to make a top 5 list. So, after deciding this would make for a great video, I sat down, pulled up the list of fights in the series, and whittled it down until I had a top 5 that I was confident in. So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. As always, I'm going to preface this with a reminder that there will be spoilers all throughout the video, so if you're not caught up on the manga, I probably wouldn't watch this video unless you're not bothered by getting spoiled. Before we begin though, please consider running up the likes and comments and dropping a subscription to the channel. We're on the road to 1K and every bit of support helps. Now without further ado, let's take a look at my top 5 fights in Jujutsu Kaisen. Kicking off the list at number 5 is Sukuna vs Mahoraga, one of the highlights of the Shibuya incident arc. This fight goes on the list for me because this is the first time in the series where we actually get to see an extended fight involving Sukuna. Some of you might be thinking that his fight against Jogo would be the first time, but in my eyes, that was less of a fight and more of a complete and utter ass beating. But against Mahoraga and its insane strength, durability, and adaptation, Sukuna is finally forced to put visible effort into defeating an opponent on screen, and to me, that's a huge deal at that point in the series. It also demonstrates just how high Sukuna's battle IQ is, as he deduces Mahoraga's blatantly overpowered ability quite quickly and takes the exact steps needed to secure his victory. I also have to give props to the animation team for taking an already stellar fight and adding so much to it to show off just how destructive this fight between two forces of nature was. And on top of that, this episode was only half finished as well due to the walkouts. Dear Mappa, for Christ's sake, treat your animators better. On top of an excellent fight, we're also treated to foreshadowing by Sukuna saving Megumi's life, and showing us that the curse's nefarious schemes don't just stop at Yuji. With how current events are, it's cool to look back and see that Gege had this all planned from the very beginning. Next up on the list, coming in at the number 4 spot, are both of Maki's fights with Naoya. Maybe it's cheating to have 2 separate fights take up a single spot, but since they're the same combatants, I figured it would be okay. Besides, narratively, they're basically 2 halves of the same fight. Both are equally important in Maki's character arc, so I'd figure I'd let it rock regardless. So I'm sure a lot of people will question why I chose these 2 fights over her massacring the Zenin clan. And it's because her fights with Naoya are the climax to her major character arc that started all the way back when. The first fight is awesome because not only do we get a taste of Maki's true potential now that she's seen as an equal to Toji, but it feels so damn cathartic to see her put hands on the son of the man who talks so much shit on her back in Shibuya. In a way, it feels like she's beating Naobito's ass too, since Naoya, being the gigantic Nepo man baby that he is, has his father's same curse technique. Damn, does it feel good to look at that fist print in his pretty stupid face. Then, not too long after that, the culling games begin, and a mysterious cursed spirit enters the barrier just for it to be revealed to be Naoya reincarnated. The hatred and misogyny were so deeply ingrained into his soul that after not only losing to a woman, but being killed by one, he immediately comes back from the dead as a curse. Say what you want about him, but the man has conviction, even if it's commitment to being the biggest piece of shit on earth. When the fight begins, Naoya is clearly a lot stronger this time around, and actually gives not only Maki a beating, but Noritoshi Kamo as well. You know, that student from season 1 that nobody remembered until he just randomly showed up. Hell, Naoya's jump in strength is to such a high degree that he's able to unleash his own domain expansion. Side note, I find it absolutely hilarious that the biggest misogynistic piece of shit gets reincarnated as a curse and has a domain expansion that both look like a woman's reproductive organs. Gege sure does love his irony, doesn't he? But thanks to the intervention of 2 eccentric sorcerers taking part in the culling game as well, Maki is able to overcome her mental barriers that were subconsciously holding her back, giving her that last push she needed and finally being able to put Naoya down for good. I've seen a few posts online about how the sumo guy training Maki in what is essentially a hyperbolic time chamber is an asspull, but this is shonen, dude. It's built on that stuff. We love that shit around these parts. If anything, at least it gives us that panel of Maki giving us that legitimate smile. Just look how happy she is. Well worth it, I'd say. The Shibuya incident was an arc of ups and downs, and there were plenty of amazing fights to choose from, but the choice for me was clear as soon as I started making this list. Coming in at the number 3 spot is Yuji and Todo versus Mahito in Shibuya's climax. The finale to Yuji and Mahito's blood feud was a long time coming. As soon as Mahito transfigured Junpei and made enemies of Yuji, I knew that the final showdown between these two would be a bloodbath, and honestly, calling it that feels like I'm selling it short a little bit. After what happens with Nanami and Nobara, Yuji is left broken, bloodied, and battered at the hands of this sick, patch-faced freak. Right before our hero is executed, we hear that clap that we're all so familiar with, and Aoi Todo re-enters the series with one of the smoothest entrances in anime history. I cannot tell you how hype I was reading this chapter for the first time, because obviously, Yuji isn't going to die at that moment. It's just a matter of who will come to his rescue, and honestly, there really was no better choice. Seeing Todo fend off Mahito with his curse technique, while simultaneously trying to reignite that flame that dwells within Yuji, is just so goddamn cool. Eventually, with the help of his domain, Mahito is able to remove Todo from the picture by taking his hand through transfiguration, so Yuji's left on his own. This is what the arc has been building up to the entire time. This final life or death confrontation between these two, and it does not disappoint at all. Mahito finally reaches his true form, because what villain isn't complete without a transformation, before ultimately succumbing to one too many black flashes. The cherry on top comes from watching this character that has caused such immense levels of suffering to our main cast flee in utter terror from Yuji as he knows his death is at hand. Seeing Mahito in such a pathetic, sad state after everything he's done brought me untold amounts of joy, especially when we finally got to see the scene animated. Not only that, but the way the ending song kicks in during the 120% potential scene is seriously so good that it legitimately brought a tear to my eye. Coming in at number 2, second place, the big runner-up, is the Sendai Colony Fatal 4-Way. When I say it out loud like that, I feel like I'm an announcer at a wrestling pay-per-view. Feels pretty cool. Alright, so before the first place fight happened, this was my favorite fight in the series by such a large margin, because it's just so unbelievably raw. In the Sendai Colony during the Culling Games, there's a deadlock between 4 extremely powerful and vicious combatants that each get their own full introduction pages that build each one of them up to be huge deals. We're even treated to chapter cover illustrations featuring Yuta, Uro, and Ryu that really stand out. Gege outdid himself when he drew those. From the description given for each fighter, you can just feel it in your bones that something huge is about to transpire between these 4, and it doesn't take very long until we're proven right when Yuta breaks that deadlock within the territory. I feel like this fight was Gege really showing off just how much he's grown as a mangaka, because it has all the ingredients for a good fight in the series, and it's a night and day compared to the fights in Shibuya. The action is brutal, there's plenty of screen time for each combatant and the fight overall, and to top it all off, we get another out-of-this-world spread page from Gege with the triple domain expansion. For this fight being the first one of Yuta's that we've seen in ages, it sure did not disappoint as he's throwing down with all 3 of the other fighters and proving why he's constantly heralded as Gojo's future successor. I really like how each fighter has an ability that works well against one of them, but isn't as effective against the others. It goes back to that checks and balances thing I had mentioned in my Why JJK is the Best Modern Shonen video, which you should check out if you haven't already. For example, Ryu's Granite Blast makes for a great tool against Yuta, who is mostly a hand-to-hand fighter, but is easily dealt with by Uro, whose curse technique can redirect it with her spatial manipulation capabilities. Eventually, the fight becomes a head-to-head between Yuta and Ryu that reminded me a lot of Yusuke's fight with Chu in the Dark Tournament. Just two fighters going at it with everything that they have, and by the end of it, reaching a mutual respect for one another through the exchange of blows. Before I talk about my pick for best fight in Jujutsu Kaisen, I figure it's a good time to discuss some of my honorable mentions that, while they're good fights in their own right, didn't make it into my top 5 for one reason or another. First up is Yuji and Kugisake versus Echo and Kechizu. The fight that topped off the first season of the anime, this fight shows the teamwork between the two first years and even ends with that sick double black flash. Being an early fight though, there's not much going on in terms of showing off the cooler aspects of the power system, and admittedly the two curse wombs aren't the most exciting opponents in the series. Piggybacking off of that, the next honorable mention is Yuji versus Chozo. This one might get me some hate since I know a lot of people love this fight, especially in the anime, and I get that completely. The choreography is stellar, and I do love how Yuji actually loses the fight since it subverts expectations given he's the protagonist of the story. This was initially going to make it into the list at the tail end as the 5th spot, but I decided to go with Sukuna vs. Mahoraga instead because of narrative relevancy. The final honorable mention is quite the electrifying one, as I have to give the spot to Hikari vs. Kashimo. With this being Hikari's first real fight, there's a lot of expectations to be had with how much he's built up in the series by his peers, and it definitely does not disappoint. From Hikari's bombastic entrance, to the reveal of his domain, and even the Aura barrage between him and Kashimo, it does a lot to get the hype train rolling. Seriously, those two knocking the giant shipping container back and forth is so simple and yet so damn cool. I'm also just such a sucker for two characters throwing down and being able to tell that they're having the time of their lives by the looks on their face and inner dialogue. Really, my only gripe with this fight is that it feels like it ends so abruptly, and it's so deflating after having gone through such a well-crafted brawl. Now, with all of the honorable mentions out of the way, it's time we talk about my number 1 fight in this series. If you're up to date on the manga, which you should be, but if you've made it to this far in the video, it should come as no surprise as to what it is. Coming in at the number 1 spot, the heavyweight champion of the world is the strongest sorcerer in history versus the strongest sorcerer of today, Gojo versus Sukuna. Yeah, this taking the number 1 spot on the list should come as a shock to absolutely no one. This fight has been built up since the very beginning of the series when Yuji initially became possessed by Sukuna, and it's one the fanbase had been anxiously waiting for years. Honestly, words don't even do justice to how much of a tight grasp this fight had on all of us whilst it was going on week in and week out. All the fraud watch and agenda pushing was actually fun to engage with for once, because this was such a spectacle to behold that everyone was in tune and having fun just watching it unfold. Needless to say, after Gojo had been sealed away for well over 100 chapters, the lead up to this fight was nothing but hype. Hell, this fight was so damn good there was an official trailer made to promote the volume of the manga where the entirety of the fight takes place. You don't get to see that too often, I feel like. Even now, almost 20 chapters since its conclusion, the battle between these two titans of the Jujutsu world feels like it's the absolute pinnacle of the series and is going to be near impossible to top. Sukuna's twisted utilization of the Zenin clan techniques, thanks to having possession over Megumi's body, shows just how big the gap is between him and every other sorcerer. On the flip side of that, we actually get to see Gojo go all out and finally engage in a fight that pushes him to the brink and beyond, which is what so many of us have been waiting to see after realizing he's so far beyond every other modern day sorcerer and curse spirit. Gege really outdoes himself here, and shows just how much he's come into his own since starting this manga. Not only do both combatants display untold levels of confidence, I feel like this Shinjuku showdown is a display of confidence from Gege as well, and I love that for him. His art is on point at all times as well, shown with all of the beautiful double-page spreads that he spoils us with. Seriously, there are so many good spreads during this fight that it legitimately feels like a cinematic experience at most points. And so much so that I wonder if they'll turn it into a full-blown movie like they did with JJK0. One can only hope, right? Also, the interactions we get between Gojo and Sukuna are seriously top-notch, because they both just get to fully be themselves whilst all this is transpiring. Gojo is his usual goofball self, even while his life is on the line, mocking Sukuna and making jokes at his expense, even when he's staring down Mahoraga and a full-blown homunculus of the rest of Megumi's Shikigami. Sukuna, on the other hand, looks down on Gojo the entire time, insulting him at every possible opportunity and exuding that patented narcissism that you can only get from a millennia-old calamity like the King of Curses. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who don't particularly care for how this fight ends, and in some facet, I understand why, but personally, I feel like the ending makes complete sense and adds weight to the narrative. For starters, we know for a fact that Gege is not a fan of Gojo, which I find absolutely hilarious, but this was the perfect opportunity to kill him, and to be completely honest, I'm glad it went down this route. Gojo's dream was to push his students to become the ultimate generation of sorcerers, free from having to be protected by him or be limited by the stipulations of the current Jujutsu society, and his death is the perfect catalyst to achieving that. It's like when Sensui kills Yusuke, and the rest of Team Urameshi gain a whole new echelon of power to carry on in his stead. Gojo couldn't stay around forever, and as much as all the fangirls watching this will disagree, it would stunt the growth of all of his students and make it impossible for his dream to come true. Now we get to see if Yuji and his peers can realize their late teacher's wishes and not only stop Sukuna, but bring about a new age of Jujutsu. Only time will tell, I guess. Woo baby, my longest video yet. We're leveling up with each upload, and I can certainly say with this one that I am so glad I got back into making videos. Thank you all so much for taking the time to watch the video, especially to those who made it this far and are hearing this. I'd love to see what you guys thought about my list down below in the comments, and maybe make one of your own. As always, if you'd like to join our community Discord, the link is in the description. We have plenty of channels dedicated to various manga, video games, and even horror, so why not drop on in and make yourself at home. Until next time, folks, make sure you keep being kind to one another, stay out of pointless online discourse, and take good care of yourselves. Bye, everybody.